How Jesus ever spoke to 5,000 plus women and children, I'll never know. Well, good morning, everyone. It's good of you to be here today, this first Sunday of Advent, to help me through my initial foray in teaching here at Pelham Friends Church. You will notice some small differences between our pastor and myself, besides the obvious ones of age and that he doesn't spell his first name correctly. There's the matter of feet. You've probably noticed by now, unless you're people that sit way at the back and are kind of oblivious, that when John's up here on the platform, he invariably comes over here and stands like this. You notice that? It's the first thing Sharon and I noticed when we came here. We were spellbound. We'd sit and we'd watch to see when he was going to pitch forward on his face. I really hope that wasn't like the Quaker style of preaching or something. I was quite worried about it. That's why I didn't put my hand up for quite a long time. At my age, balance is a big thing. But, you know, the bigger difference is that John's a professional pastor and preacher, and as he mentioned, I'm a professional academic and teacher. So John carefully interprets and applies the biblical text, and then he exhorts you with tremendous skill, I have to add, to live for Christ. I carefully interpret and apply the biblical text, and then I exhort you to go home, do your homework. So that's a big difference between the two of us. And I have passed out, I wouldn't want to call it homework, but you got these sheets with the Herodian family on them. That's not, I don't want you reading that now. It's more interesting than my sermon, but don't read it. And you can take it home and you can use it for research purposes later on. So other than those small differences, there's not a lot to choose between us. Now, during this wonderful Advent season, we will be considering 4 topics on the 4 Advent Sundays that are much associated with this time of year. They're hope, peace, love, and joy. And the responsibility given to me, as John said, is to consider hope, and specifically within the context of empire and oppression. And I've never preached on the topic of hope before, so it took me quite a while to get this together. About 2 months, actually. Not every minute. So here's what we're going to explore over the next 25 minutes. First, we'll look at this beautiful, but at times troubling biblical topic of hope in its biblical context, living with and for Christ in Jesus and the apostles' time. And then I'll explain why John suggested that we study hope in the context of empire and oppression by looking at the most malevolent opponents to biblical hope at that time, particularly a few members of the Herodian family, the Herods, not the whole bunch on the sheet. We'll just look at 3 of them. And then, having filled in the historical and political context with a description of what today would be called those important influencers, I'll suss out just what hope really means and doesn't mean. Obviously, it's an important topic. Hope is mentioned more than 160 times in the New Testament alone. And finally, I'll try to take an honest look at why the hope we long for doesn't seem, just as with money, to always grow on trees. So what does the Bible mean when it talks about hope? My very favorite Old Testament prophet, Isaiah, promised in chapter 40, "But those who hope in the Lord will renew their strength. They will soar on wings like eagles." Well, because we don't always feel like lifting off the nearest branch, spiritually speaking, I think we need to explore Isaiah's idea of hope further, and there's no better time to do it than Advent. All right, but first this commercial. I can't emphasize enough that a scriptural passage is best understood in its historical and social and political and economic and religious contexts. This is how we can dig out the principles and the values and the goals underlying the specific teaching in the particular biblical time and place and circumstances, And then having dug those out, apply those timeless principles to life today. Barker made a big deal out of this in his very last session. It was great. I loved it. I wish I could have just taped it and played it. Said it much better than I do. When we read or watch a news story about something going on here in Canada or Ontario, we are typically aware of what is behind the specific context of the story itself. We can make sense of the information within its proper 2024 Canadian context. It's easy. We can do it automatically. We don't always have that luxury, however, with remote 2,000 and 3,000 year old biblical material. We don't always have a good grasp of the context within which it was written. It's a problem for preachers and teachers. And I think that is why you often find very different understandings of the same biblical text amongst various individuals. If we don't see what was going on at the time that the scriptural passage was written, or anything about the audience to whom it was addressed, or why they needed to hear it, we may simply and wrongly read into the passage our 2024 Canadian understandings or our personal preferences and biases of how we would like things to be understood rather than how they were originally taught. Don't do that. A text, here's my Barker slogan. Barker's got slogans right for every book he looks at. Here's mine. A text without a context is a pretext. You got that? A text without a context is a pretext. Okay, that's my commercial. Now to move on to the good old Herod family. And this is the reason behind today's handout. So much of what went on at the time of Jesus and the early church as well, the book of Acts, was played out against the backdrop of the political machinations of the good family Herod and their Roman masters. Not everyone realizes that there are 10 of these Herods altogether in the biblical record and just outside of it. Not just one. We often think Herod, oh yeah, Herod. No. There's a whole bunch of Herods. And some are only called Herod, so you don't know which one it is necessarily. But there's 10 of them found in the Gospels and the book of Acts, and their wicked influence on the events of the New Testament is at times profound. So to help us prepare for this study, I've asked two young members of our community of faith here, Kaylin and Calvin, to read today's scriptures. Kaylin's going to read Matthew 2, verses 1 to 12, plus verse 16, and then Calvin is going to read Matthew 12, 1 to 14. John's going to help me out with the mic. You're first, dear. You can stand anywhere you want. You got a mic. You could even, squat down behind a chair and do it. We'd still hear you.
After Jesus was born in Bethlehem, in Judah, during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, "Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all of Jerusalem with him. When he had called together all of the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, he asked them, "Where is the Messiah was to be born?" "In Bethlehem, in Judah," they replied, "for this is what the prophet has written. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people of Israel." Then Herod called the Magi secretly and found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and search carefully for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me, so that I too may go and worship him." After they had heard the king, they went on their way, and the star they had seen when it rose went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. Then they saw the star. They were overjoyed on coming to the house. They saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshipped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route. When Herod realized that he had been outwitted by the Magi, he found furious, and he gave orders to kill all boys in Bethlehem and its area who were 2 years old and under, in accordance with the time he had learned from the Magi.
Thank you very much, Calvin.
At that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry and began to pick some heads of grain and eat them. When the Pharisees saw this, they said to him, "Look, your disciples are doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath." He answered, "Haven't you read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He entered the house of God, and he and his companions ate the consecrated bread, which was not lawful for them to do, but only for the priests. Or haven't you read in the law that the priests on Sabbath duty in the temple desecrate the Sabbath and yet are innocent? I tell you that something greater than the temple is here. If you had known what these words mean, 'I desire mercy, not sacrifice,' you would not have condemned the innocent. For the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath." Going on from that place, he went into their synagogue, and a man with a shriveled hand was there. Looking for a reason to bring charges against Jesus, they asked him, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath?" Jesus said to them, "If any of you has a sheep, and it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will you not take hold of it and lift it out? How much more valuable is a person than a sheep? Therefore it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath." Then he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." So the man stretched his hand out, and it was completely restored, just as sound as the other. But the Pharisees went out and plotted how they might kill Jesus.
Thank you very much indeed. Now, if you'd like to go and join your friends downstairs in the comfy chair room, that's entirely up to you. The Herod family were Idumeans, as they're called in the New Testament, or Edomites, as it's said in the Old. Dr. Barker talked about the Edomites, or Idumeans, in his study on Monday night of the Old Testament prophet of Obadiah. And they were descended from Abraham through Isaac, but through Esau, rather than through Isaac and Jacob, making them distant cousins of the Jews. Despite what you might expect, however, these Idumeans were enemies of God's people in the Old Testament. Now, the Judean king Antipater, the patriarch of the Herod family, the founder of that group, doesn't appear in the biblical record. You won't find his name anywhere. He formally converted to the Jewish religious practices of the descendants of Jacob, however, after assuming the throne of Judea on behalf of the Romans. In fact, I think the Romans made it a criterion that he would have to convert to Judaism. And so Antipater's family would not allow their portraits, graven images, don't you know, to appear on coins. They did not eat pork, as they followed the Jewish dietary laws. And the women of the family were not allowed to marry anyone who was uncircumcised, all good Jewish ideology. But the family also followed Roman social practices considerably. For instance, the Herods traveled to Rome frequently and commissioned buildings back home in the Roman style of architecture. Members of the family sponsored athletic games in the Greek style, which were offensive to the Jews. And they also arranged marriages between uncles and nieces in the Roman fashion. So they were a mixed bag of Jewish faith and practice while being assimilated in countless ways into the dominant Roman culture. We'll look very quickly at just three of them to get an idea of how a person faithful to God fared with the Herods in charge. Spoiler alert, not well. You can read up the rest on that outline at your leisure. So Herod the Great. The best known of the family is this Herod, whose reign overlapped with the earliest days of Jesus' life on earth. He was the quintessential mixed bag of Jewish faith, some, and being immersed in the Roman culture, lots. For instance, Herod rebuilt the temple in Jerusalem from a rather small affair into a magnificent building. After he completed the work, of course, he deeply offended the Jews of Jerusalem by placing an eagle, which is the emblem of Roman rule, on the temple. Herod's last act in life was overseeing the execution of the Jews who tore that eagle down. In Matthew 2, as Kaylin read, wise men from the east asked Herod the Great where the king of the Jews was to be born. Herod was deeply disturbed because he had earned the title king of the Jews from the Romans, and he was planning that one of his sons would inherit the title from him in turn. Equally disturbing was the fact that the child was to be born in Bethlehem, which was the site of Herod's summer palace. So as Kaylin read, he ordered the slaughter of all boys in Bethlehem under the age of 2, which historians estimate to be about 10 to 20 children. Some of the old medieval paintings had heaps of the slaughter of the innocents, mountains of babies. It was pretty bad, but it was only about 10 to 20 kids. And this caused Joseph and Mary to take Jesus to Egypt for safety, and Joseph did not bring his family back to his hometown of Nazareth until after Herod the Great's death. An indication of just what sort of person this Herod the Great was can be seen in his rather unusual relationship with his many sons. He had a bunch of them. The old tyrant first wanted his 2 favorite boys to be next in line to his throne, but subsequently he had to execute them on charges of treason. After which his third alternative, his oldest son, was charged and executed for trying to poison his father. You thought your family was dysfunctional. Finally, the now elderly Herod fell back on his youngest son, Antipas, simply called Herod in Mark chapter 8, but he was Herod Antipas, and 2 other sons, Archelaus and Philip. So in the end, 3 of his remaining boys by various wives got a piece of the kingdom, and none were ever called king on daddy's orders. You can see why the slaughter of the Bethlehem infants was just another administrative detail for this bloodthirsty ruler. Lovely fellow. I always picture him looking like Henry VIII for some reason. Now Herod Archelaus. He was one of the 3 sons that made the cut, as it were, literally. And he ruled Judea and Samaria after the death of his father. So he would have been the king in Jerusalem. In Matthew 2, verse 22, Joseph decided to take his family north. He bypassed Judea entirely and hiked off up to the north of Galilee because he was just as afraid of Archelaus as he was of his dad, Herod the Great. Archelaus turned out to be a total failure. He was just useless in the eyes of the Romans. So he was replaced, but not by another Jew, but by a Roman governor. From then on, Judea was ruled by a Roman governor, and of course, never a Jewish one, and of course, at one point, Pilate was that governor. Archelaus' full brother, Herod Antipas, was what the Old Testament calls, the New Testament calls tetrarch, or governor, of Galilee and another area to the north, Perea. And his half-brother, Herod Philip, governed other portions of Herod's big kingdom. And their niece, Herodias, first married and divorced an uncle living in Rome, and then she married her uncle Philip, and then she divorced Philip to marry Antipas, also an uncle, of course, so she was married to 3 consecutive uncles. Antipas was often depicted as being somewhat weak. Perhaps this is why Jesus in Luke 13 called him a fox. Beware of that fox, Herod. A fox was understood to be in those days a weak animal that had to achieve its ends through cunning deceit. And who can forget this depiction of Antipas in Jesus Christ Superstar?
I am overjoyed to meet you face to face.
Now, many of you possibly reacted to that scene with revulsion, as I did. But Antipas was a revolting person. Never mind an island full of such people as you just witnessed. It took only one scantily clad, at best, stepdaughter dancing in his court to make him decide on a most hideous act of great consequence to the new Christian movement, as we'll see in a moment. Of course, at the end of that song, Antipas was yelling, "Aren't you scared of me, Christ? You aren't the Lord. You are nothing but a fraud. Get out of my life." When John the Baptist preached against the marriage and divorce pattern that I just described within Antipas' family, Antipas had him thrown into prison. The daughter of Herodias, his wife/niece, her daughter, pleased Antipas with her dancing. And he offered her in response any reward she wanted. With her mother's prompting, she requested the head of John the Baptist on a platter. And Antipas ordered John beheaded. That's all in Mark chapter 8. Okay, lovely fellow too. I'll skip over the rest of the Herodians in your outline. I think that's probably all we can stomach of this odious group. Thus endeth the lecture. On to the exploration of the role of Christian hope played out at that time and in such frightful contexts as these: empire and oppression. So let's move on to a New Testament teaching on hope versus some modern understandings. Matthew 12 quotes the prince of Old Testament prophets, Isaiah of Jerusalem, concerning Jesus as follows. Any chance I get to quote Isaiah, I do. "Here is my servant whom I have chosen. Here's my servant whom I have chosen, the one I love, in whom I delight. I will put my spirit on him, and he will proclaim justice to the nations. In Jesus' name, the nations will put their hope." And these confident words that Matthew, the disciple, was claiming about Jesus, remember that they were spoken at a time when Jesus wasn't the only Messiah that the Jews ever experienced. There were lots of them. Plenty of would-be Jewish Messiahs were circulating at various times before, during, and after the gospel record. And they had attempted various insurrections against the Herodian and Roman authorities and paid for it with their lives, as did followers of Jesus, such as, of course, John the Baptist. But expressions of Christian hope, despite this background, despite this context, are spoken repeatedly by Jesus and his followers, despite the constant and often deadly pushback. This came not only from the political leadership, but, as my man Calvin read, from the religious big shots as well, the Sadducees and the Pharisees who plotted to kill Jesus. So we better see exactly what hope meant at that time, given the context in which it was uttered. Now, today, hope is commonly used to mean a wish, and it has no basis in anything other than the desire of the person expressing it. And examples are things like, "I hope I win the lottery," or "I hope the Leafs win the Stanley Cup." Fat chance of either. Alternatively, it is understood today in some Christian circles as referring only to the eternal state, far from our time here in the confusing and threatening world. And there's no doubt that such an understanding of the word is not entirely inappropriate. The New Testament letter to St. Paul to his friend Titus in chapter 2 refers to the blessed hope, the glorious appearing of our great God and Savior, Jesus Christ, what we typically call the second coming. But living with this understanding of hope alone is strictly to be passive regarding having hope on earth now. And it's wholly future-oriented, having no reference at all to daily living. This leaves us basically without hope as far as any good thing happening in the here and now, and it represents the hold the fort till Jesus returns mentality. But in the Bible, references to hope in the here and now ring with confidence. The expectation that God has promised something, and we believe those promises on the strength of God's historic and ongoing faithfulness. As that marvelous modern scholar and Anglican Bishop N.T. Wright explains, Jesus' teaching in the Gospels is not how to leave this world and go somewhere else, he taught us to pray, your kingdom come, your will be done, say it with me, on earth as it is in heaven. And he went around doing it. For instance, having celebratory parties with the newly marginalized, healing, and feeding people who had next to nothing. And he did these things, as Calvin read, even when the results were that the highly influential Pharisees plotted to kill him. Clearly, this hope was not some wish, but rather a conviction that God would accomplish great things in our time, regardless of any opposition, no matter how entrenched and how influential. We Jesus people, if I can use an old term from my early days, and some of you too, should not be discouraged at setbacks, even great setbacks, such as attempts to be discredited, pushed to the margins, even in one famous case, hanged on a cross. So strong was the Apostle Paul's conviction about this Christian attribute of hope that he listed it along with faith and love as the three central characteristics of Christian living, saying in 1 Corinthians 13, and now these three remain, faith, hope, and love. And what was life like for St. Paul when he wrote the centrality of hope, which filled him with faith and love? The apostle was such an irritant and such a perceived danger to the political authorities that he continually found himself in prison. He even wrote some of his letters to churches while chained to a wall. He actually had to use a secretary, what they call in falutin circles, an amanuensis, to write those letters for him. Paul was a realist. Paul was not, it's hard to be anything but when you're chained to a wall, and sometimes with your jailkeeper chained on your other arm. He was a realist about his difficult circumstances, but he was still able to proclaim in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, one of the really awe-inspiring and amazing verses of the Bible, a set of verses. We are hard-pressed on every side, but not crushed, perplexed, but not in despair, persecuted, but not abandoned, struck down, but not destroyed. We always carry around in our body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be revealed in our body. The equally persecuted apostle Peter wrote to Christians in 1 Peter 4, dear friends, don't be surprised at the fiery ordeal that has come on you to test you as though something strange were happening to you. But rejoice, since you participate in the sufferings of Christ. Rejoice, so that you may be overjoyed when his glory is revealed. And their apostolic colleague, St. John, writing from exile to several Christian churches in what we now know as Turkey, was equally hopeful, equally confident, equally full of faith when he quoted the risen Christ to one of the weakest, most faltering of these little churches, Philadelphia, in Revelation chapter 3. I love this because I've over the years been a member of more little weak, small, faltering churches than anything else. These are the words of him who is holy and true, the risen Christ, of course, who holds the key of David. What he opens, no one can shut. And what he shuts, no one can open. I know your deeds, Philadelphians. I know that you have little strength, that you have kept my word and have not denied my name. See, I have placed before you an open door that no one can shut. To put these hope-filled words of Paul, Peter, and John another way, hope means that we should be living, believing that God is running the world, and that there are our own open doors here in Pelham, Welland, St. Catharines, Fonthill, and area, Smithville. There are our own open doors and our own opportunities to see that hope comes to fruition. All right. I want to bring this message to a conclusion by moving from the historical and theological, which are more of the cognitive approach to preaching, and and interpreting and so on, to the more affective and visceral. I call this theology from the ground up, theology on the basis of what we actually experience. I want to express how everything we have been considering up to now seems to work, at least to me, in real life, not just in books. First off, I see a very close link between hope and faith. You've probably noticed it too. Hebrews 11, verse 1 defines faith as the assurance. Faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. Hope is tied up with assurance, conviction, and faith, despite evidence. But faith can be a very tricky business, as I'm sure we all know. When Jesus' apostles asked their Lord to increase their faith, apparently they felt they were really low in that category, and these are the apostles. He replied in Matthew 17, "Truly I tell you, if you have faith as small as a mustard seed, you can say to this mountain," I'm not talking about the mountain so-called in Hamilton, I'm talking about the ones I lived in BC. You can say to this mountain, "Move from here to there," and it will move. Nothing will be impossible for you. That's hard to hear when we feel like our faith is faltering, that it is being replaced by uncertainty, and that it goes unrewarded, particularly with respect to some of the things we often pray for, like a job, healing, restored relationships. What are the chances for hope in such circumstances? The great challenge to the Christian is wonderfully addressed in an outstanding movie. Bringing Hollywood in here. It's currently in the theaters. It's called Convocation. Any of you seen it? Oh. Convocation. Who are you and what did they do with the professor? Convocation. If any of you... I like Convocation better. Conclave. Have any of you seen that? Still hardly any hands. Holy smokes. Well, run right out and see it. Conclave. The movie depicts the choosing of a new pope. And Ralph Fiennes, Marvel's actor, of course, plays Cardinal Lawrence, the dean of the College of Cardinals, and he has to preside over the voting. And in his opening homily, quite startling to his fellow cardinals, he says this: "My brothers and sisters, in the course of a long life in the service of our mother, the church, let me tell you that the one sin I have come to fear more than any other is certainty. Certainty is the great enemy of unity. Certainty is the deadly enemy of tolerance. Even Christ was not certain at the end. Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani." He cried out in his agony in his 9th hour on the cross. My God, why have you forsaken me?" Our faith is a living thing precisely because it walks hand in hand with doubt. If there was only certainty, and if there was no doubt, there would be no mystery and no need for faith. Dean Lawrence concludes his homily with another startling admonition. Let us pray for a new pope who doubts, sins, asks for forgiveness, and carries on. Mystery, doubt, sin. There is room for faith and hope in this context. Doubtless we've all had such moments, maybe very long moments, when the exercise of faith was difficult and hope seemed to be dying a borning. Recently, John asked some of us, it was one of those family nights, I think, to do something creative with respect to our faith, such as drawing something or writing a poem or otherwise expressing our faith and hope artistically. In the 25 minutes we were given, I was somehow drawn to open the Bible to Psalm 23. And in a sort of white heat, I described the lack of hope I was feeling at that moment in time. And just an excerpt. "The Lord is my question mark. I don't understand. He wants me to lie down in green pastures and be at ease beside still waters, but my soul is not refreshed. It is confused." Ring a bell for anyone? Am I the only one? But we read the words of Peter, Paul, and John. They went through all the temptations to doubt and more. And we are not supposed to be surprised when this happens. If confident living and the exercise of great personal faith in order for God's will to be done were up to us alone, hope wouldn't necessarily be very thick on the ground at times. But remember why Christ crashed into our world and into our story at Advent. He came to save us. He came to make us a people who share in his divine life. He came to show us the depth of God's love for us. And he came to be a model of faith, hope, and love, and to show us how to live with the confidence that God is running the world. For all these reasons, the author of the New Testament book of Hebrews gave us this marvelous province. Chapter 10. Let us hold unswervingly to the hope we profess, for he who promised is faithful. While we have seen that our hope and faith are definitely intertwined, God is not dependent on our faith for his will to be done on earth. And our hope is dependent on the promise of his faithfulness, not ours. He doesn't wait until our level of faith is up to the top of some spiritual dipstick before his favor and power click in. Great faith is a wonderful thing for each of us to have, and Jesus promised that we don't really need much at all to accomplish great things, but that faith may ebb and flow as we often bruised and battered human beings struggle to cope with life at times. No, our hope for God's expanding kingdom in this world is not dependent primarily on our often cracked and broken faith. Not if living triumphantly for Christ in the present culture is our objective. Our hope is dependent first and foremost on his faithfulness. Canadian poet and songwriter Leonard Cohen, first I was quoting Hollywood, now I'm quoting Buddhist of Jewish ethnic background. Canadian poet and songwriter Leonard Cohen captured our struggle as broken people rather aptly, I think, in his anthem, which he sang as only he can sing. Ring the bells that you still can ring. Forget your perfect offering. There is a crack in everything. How does that end? That's how the light gets in. And who is the light of the world that gets through those cracks, that brokenness? Jesus. Whoever follows me, John quoted in John 8, whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but have the light of life. And with that light, we have his faithfulness and our hope. Will you please stand for our closing prayer and benediction? May we say with the psalmist, for God alone my soul waits in silence. In silence, for my hope is from him. He alone is my rock and my salvation, my fortress. I shall not be shaken. Amen. May it be so. Now may the God of hope fill you with all joy and peace as you trust in him, so that you may overflow with hope by the power of the Holy Spirit. A blessed Advent to you all, filled with hope, peace, love, and joy.